Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jadley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We're so delighted and so honored that you're joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Kendare Blake. She is returning to the show to celebrate her young adult title. It's called All These Bodies. Before we invite Kendare into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Freaky Funky Fish. Odd Facts About Fascinating Fish by Deborah Kemp Shoemaker. From zapping, stinging, even singing, to playing dead or having a see-through head, discover interesting things different fish do to survive in this delightful non-fiction picture book. Fish have fins and gills and tails. All fish swim and most have scales. But not all fish act or look the same. From zapping, stinging, even singing, Fresh Funky Fish, Odd Facts About Fascinating Fish is an adorable picture book with a scientific and child-friendly underpinning. Your kids are going to absolutely love this wonderful picture book by Deborah Kemp Shoemaker. Check it out today. Freaky Funky Fish, Odd Facts About Fascinating Fish. Join us right now from the great state of Washington. Our guest is returning to the show. I love having our guest on. She's here to celebrate her brand new young adult title. It's called All These Bodies. Please welcome back to the show, Kendare Blake. Hey, Kendare, how are you?
Good. Yay. Thank you so much for having me back.
I'm excited to have you back, and I'm excited to speak to you about All These Bodies. In the notes that you sent me about the show, you said it's writing something true crime inspired, and writing in the world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm just really intrigued. Tell us about All These Bodies, please.
Sure. So All These Bodies, it's a kind of a murder mystery thriller. It's the story of two teenagers who get caught up in this violent murder spree in the 1950s Midwest. So throughout the summer, all of these murder victims have turned up, and their throats have been cut, and they're totally empty of blood, but there's no blood left at the scene, which is very terrifying and perplexing to everybody. So Marie Catherine Hale is a 15-year-old girl, and she's found in the middle of a farmhouse where an entire family has just been slaughtered. And while they have been completely drained of blood, she is covered in it from head to toe. Initially, they think she might be an escaped victim, but when they clean her up, they realize none of that blood's hers. So she becomes the number one suspect. Oof. And Michael Jensen is the 17-year-old son of the local sheriff. He's an aspiring journalist, and he just happens to be the only person who Marie will tell her story to.
Wow. This is a thriller.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun to write. Surprisingly, I for something that's so, morbid and full of murders.
So what exactly inspired this thrilling kind of morbid story?
Well, a couple of things. First off, the story had been in my head since before I started writing my previous series, Three Dark Crowns. And I've been writing Three Dark Crowns for the previous 5 years. That series is 4 books long, 4.5 really, if you count the novellas. And I kind of needed a palate cleanser. So when my publisher asked me what I wanted to do next, I thought, well, All These Bodies has been rolling around in my head since then, and it's pretty weird and it's pretty different, so why not that? The story itself was inspired by three true things. It was inspired in part by the Clutter murders, which was profiled famously by Truman Capote in his novel In Cold Blood. And it was also inspired by the 1958 crime spree, 11-victim murder spree of Charlie Starkweather and his teenage girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. At the time of the murders, Charlie was 19, Carol was only 14, and even though after they were caught, she professed her innocence and said she was a hostage, nobody believed her, and she was convicted and served most of a life sentence. Charlie went on to the electric chair. And then it was also inspired by the vampire hysteria of New England. So I like to call all these bodies true crime with a vampire.
Yeah. Wow. You know, I'm imagining there might be a parent out there thinking, I don't want my 17-year-old to read this stuff, but I tell you, your 17-year-old wants to read this. They're fascinated by it. My daughter and I read In Cold Blood together when she was 17. She brought it to me, and she was able to handle it a little bit better than I was, I think.
Well, yeah. I mean, this novel actually, I think, pairs well with In Cold Blood. Like, if any teachers are teaching In Cold Blood, this might be a nice, even though it's also set in 1958, it's told in a more contemporary style, so it might be a good pairing. And, I mean, In Cold Blood, if you think about it, it wasn't only about the murders. It was also about the effect of something terrible on a small town. So there are lots of themes that can be discussed between parents and kids, between teachers and students. And I love that about the horror genre in particular. I love smart horror, where horror is kind of a metaphor for something else. So I tried to make sure that all these bodies functions on lots of levels. On the surface as just kind of a rip-roaring thriller, but for the readers who want to dig a little deeper, there's a lot more going on there thematically about the nature of belief and truth and the stories that young women are allowed to tell if they want to be believed, their agency and that sort of thing. Yeah.
You know, you bring up stories that young women want to tell. This seems to be, these dark, complex horror thrillers seem to be especially interesting to young women. Why do you think that might be?
Well, I think they're actually interesting to everybody, and I don't know why. I think that crime is real. We see it in our everyday life, and there's a reason why true crime podcasts are so popular, and why we're constantly watching Dateline. It's because these things are real, and we want to understand them. As humans, we want to know what could make something like this happen. Maybe in order to prevent it, or maybe just so the world doesn't seem so scary. Once you have answers to questions, you feel better about it. Once the jury comes back with something, you feel better about it. Once somebody is caught, you feel better about it. But with all these bodies, I wanted to raise a lot of those questions about true crime and the nature of it, and about how only the killer and the victim really know for sure what happened, and the rest of us are just kind of following along with the podcast.
Yeah, you're right. True crime podcasts are incredibly popular. I should try to figure out a way to do a true crime podcast that talks about kids' books. I don't think it's going to fit. Was it difficult for you to get yourself in this space to write this story?
No and yes. Yes, in that it obviously took a long time for the story to arrive, since it was forming itself in my head all the way back in 2015, 2014. When I pitched my agent, I pitched both ideas. I pitched All These Bodies and Three Dark Crowns, and Three Dark Crowns clearly had the leg up. But since then, it's been rolling around, and it's been gaining steam, and it was getting weirder and weirder, and now there was a vampire involved, and I thought, I'd better write it before it just goes completely bonkers. So once I actually sat down to write it, I had been thinking about it for so long that the only thing left was really to decide and get to know the characters intimately, the way you do through the writing. And I was lucky because the narrator is Michael, 17-year-old aspiring journalist. And he was a delightful narrator to work with. I haven't had such an easy time working with a narrator since my first protagonist, Kaz, from Anna Dressed in Blood. He was just a gentleman, just very obliging, a very earnest kid who didn't have any preconceived notions about things and who only wanted the opportunity to find the truth. Very willing to listen, very open to new ideas. In short, he was the perfect person for Marie, this accused murderess, to tell her story to, because he was maybe the only one who was going to give her a chance.
Yeah. I love as I'm listening to you speak about him, he's a real person to you. Do all of your characters become real in that same way as you're creating them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say definitely. By the time I put, fingers to keyboard, I've been spying, for lack of a better word. I've been spying on these characters for usually a number of years and just, listening in on their interactions, getting to know their voice, getting to know their cadence, the way they phrase things, the way they think, the way they move. I don't see faces, but I definitely see like shadows of gesture and everything. And so, yeah, I thoroughly believe that all of our stories as writers are, real in another dimension, multiverse theory. Somewhere all of our stories are real and we're just taking them down and putting them to paper.
Did he surprise you at all as you were writing?
Michael did not. As much as I enjoy him and I really like him as a person and as a narrator, he was well behaved. He did have a few slight surprises for me over the course of the story, but the one who really surprised me was Marie. And that was particularly surprising because I'd never written a mystery before. Mm-hmm. I'm usually a so-called pantser, so I go into the story blind with characters and a concept, and then I just turn them loose and see what happens. But with all these bodies, I had to know what happened before I started. I had to know exactly what happened to all of these people. And I had to know what the crimes were, and I had to know the story that she was trying to sell and just let her parse it out and kind of help her decide when to drop these clues and what would be most intriguing to Michael and what would be most intriguing to the reader. So I thought I knew her inside and out, and I did not at all. She was very complex, and I had to write her portions twice because I got her voice wrong. It just wasn't coming together, and I realized, well, that's because it's not her. And as soon as I went through a second time and I kind of let her be angrier, her voice became much more a voice of a defensive, traumatized young woman. Mm-hmm. And that's when, she really came through.
It sounds like this was a completely different experience for you in terms of writing. You had to almost tell the story from the end, backwards. Or I'm not saying that right, but I think you know what I mean. As opposed to your other series, which kind of opened up to you as you were writing. Yeah,
and I thought maybe that would make it more boring for me because when I'm writing my other books, I'm along for the adventure, which as a writer and a reader is a great joy. But I was still along for the ride with Michael. Even though I knew what happened, I didn't know what he would think of it. I didn't know where his relationship with Marie would wind up at the end of the story. I didn't know if they would be enemies, if they would be, begrudging allies, or if they would be something entirely different. So it was a great deal of fun to put them together in that interrogation room and let the whole thing play out.
Was it difficult for you writing in that time? I was around for a little bit of the 50s, but I don't remember. But it was a very different world back then. How did you kind of get your mind back into that 50s era?
Well, I did a lot of the case research. I reread In Cold Blood, of course. I read some books regarding the Clutter murders. I read some books regarding the Starkweather Fugate crime spree and the ensuing trials. And that kind of put me back in like, okay, so this was the procedure of the day. This is how they handled everything. It was very different seeing how difficult it was for them to track these two kids who were just leaving this blood-soaked path through Lincoln, Nebraska, and all these different states, and just terrorizing everyone, and very, very hard to catch. I think we would catch them faster now, with surveillance and everybody able to report things on their phone instantly. Everybody just out and about more than they were in those days. But yeah, it was a no-brainer to set it in the 1950s, since both of the crimes that it was inspired by took place within the same 2-year period. And it was a no-brainer to set it in a small town in the Midwest, because those crimes also took places across small towns across the Midwest. And I myself grew up in a small town in rural Minnesota, so I was very comfortable writing there. I didn't grow up in 1958, but you'd be surprised at how many things are similar.
Wow. What do you think? Because all these bodies is based on true stories of horrific crimes committed by kids, very young adults, teenagers. What do you think might drive a teenager to that point? Because we've seen since 1958, we've seen teenagers commit horrific crimes in schools and on the city streets. What is it you think that might push a kid over?
Well, in the case of Charlie and Carol, that's what fascinated me. I've been familiar with the Caroline Fugate, Charlie Starkweather story since like I was a kid. I think I saw that Murder in the Heartland TV miniseries starring Tim Roth and Fairuza Balk with my mom. Like we watched it whenever it aired on TV. And I was so interested because she was so young. I think Carol would have been about the same age that I was when I watched that miniseries. So I identified with her a bit. And it was so perplexing to me to think, Charlie was this older guy. He had, the leather coat and the cigarette hanging from his lip and the slicked back hair. He was a very James Dean stand-in. Even if he was, once you got to know him, he was fairly awkward and had a lot of social problems. But I could see how a girl like Carol could be swept up by this guy with the car and the cool clothes who bought her all these presents and then, kind of turned bad. She had broken up with him before the murder spree. And, it just went all wrong. And I've also really been fascinated by the fact that nobody really seemed to care what her version of events were. She was only 14 years old. She was a child. And people treated her like she was a hardened harlot of the streets. And I thought that always struck me as slightly unfair. Like just because if Charlie had not been her boyfriend or her ex-boyfriend and he'd just been a stranger off the street, she would have been treated completely differently and her words would have been given more weight. So I don't know what exactly could drive a teenager to do something like this. I suspect that when it happens, the motivations are slightly different for everybody. But in Carol's case, I wondered if she had really been involved at all.
Yeah. Tough to think about what's going on in anybody's mind, but especially a young person's mind, a teenager's mind, that would drive them to commit such horrific acts.
Yeah.
Since you went into this world with all these bodies, is this a world that you want to stay in?
No. I mean, I love the characters. I love the town. I love the small kind of Mayberry feel that it has, even though it has, a lot of suspicion and potential for violence under the surface. I love that about small towns, how they're very, insular, but they know how to keep strangers at arm's length. I would love to stay there and, remain with Marie and Michael for a longer period of time, but the story's over, and I really don't think there are any more stories to be told in that particular town. Will I ever write another like historical crime? Maybe. Mm-hmm. I tend to keep coming back to kind of horror or murder every couple of years. So it depends. It depends on what inspires me down the road.
Yeah. Now, I know that you were working on a number of different projects over the long pandemic we hopefully are coming out of. Can you give us a hint at anything else that might be coming out in the near future?
Oh, yeah. In the very near future, I have a new trilogy launching that's set in the same universe as Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Ooh. So I'm writing new Buffy books for Disney, and I'm very excited. The first one is called In Every Generation, and it releases on January 4th. And it centers on a very familiar cast of characters. For fans of the show, they will recognize the name of Willow Rosenberg. And the new Vampire Slayer is actually her daughter, Frankie. So it was a great deal of fun. I've been a huge Buffy fan since I was a kid. So being able to play in that sandbox and update the world and the universe for a new generation of readers it basically made my pandemic. Like it was so much fun. It was just plain, pure, unadulterated fun. And I kind of forgot what was going on around me while I was working on it.
Oh, that's exciting. Well, we have to invite you back to talk and celebrate that book when they become available.
Yeah, absolutely. I love to talk Buffy.
Yeah. Well, and I will have to buff up on my Buffy in preparation for that. But until then, I know people are going to want to know where they can go to learn more about you and learn more about all these bodies.
Well, I am online in all of the usual places except for TikTok because I refuse. I can't do video. I don't have it in me. I'm on Instagram and Twitter. My handles are my name @Kendare Blake, and I'm also online at KendareBlake.com.
Yeah. We've had a great time speaking about All These Bodies, the brand new thriller from our friend Kendare Blake. Hey, Kendare, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love this podcast. It's so much fun.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Emily Barth Eisler. She'll be here to talk about her book, Aftermath. That's the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, please visit readingwithyourkids.com and click on the author's Click Here button. That way you can find out the many different ways that we can help you tell the world about your fantastic children's book. You can be a guest on the podcast. Being a guest, it's fun, it's easy, it doesn't cost you a thing. You could also check out our Certified Great Read program. If our panel believes that your book is worthy of 4 or 5 out of 5 stars, it becomes a Certified Great Read. You can also find out about our monthly promotion program that will let people know about your book through commercials on the podcast, through blasts to our social media following of over 55,000 people, and get your book displayed on our nationwide network of digital pedestrian billboards. You can learn all about it by going to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, and clicking on the author's Click Here button at the top of the page. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Kendare Blake. Please be sure to check out All These Bodies. Also want to thank our sponsor, Freaky Funky Fish, Odd Facts About Fascinating Fish by Deborah Kemp Shoemaker. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Michael Murphy. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.
Thank you.